Today's daf is daf Samach Beis. And we got up to Heid, which is at the end of the third line. Heid Rabbi Yossi ben Hameshula Mishum Rabbi Yochanan Achiv Shalom Mishum Rabbi Eliezer ben Chasma Ein Osim Chalas Ha'Oretz B'Tahara. And what this means is there are people who are hired to prepare the dough by mixing water with flour, and they do the kneading of the dough. Those are called gabolim, milashon gibul, and they should not do this act of being megabel on chalas amaretz. The amaretz is bechezkas kelim tmeim, and therefore, even though the balabayis, the amoretz, commissioned the gabol to prepare the isa b'tahara, because once the isa is prepared with gilgul isa, we have a chiyuv hafroshas chala, and hafroshas chala requires tahara. But nevertheless, the gabol should not go ahead and present this isa as if it was tahar, it was a tahora, because we assume that even before he got to the point of doing the final preparation, it already was a tmeya. It was already contaminated, and it contracted tumah. However, right, and then there's going to be a michshol for a kohen. Let's say a kohen receives this truma, and he gets the impression from the gabel that it's truma tahora, when in fact it's truma tmeya. However, there is a way in which the gabel could circumvent this problem. Aval osim isas chulav, the chulin bitara. The chaver is allowed to prepare the dough bechezkas tara. And what does he do? Instead of putting it into one of the kelim of the balabayas of the amaretz, which would be metame the chala, notel heimena kidei chala menicha bekfisha o ba'anchusa. He should place the chala in a kli which is not makabel tumah, so that even though the amaretz is in possession of, let's say, 90% of his vessels are contaminated, they would contaminate the isa that's chala, but nevertheless, he has a certain percentage of utensils that are not makabel tumah. Now, what does it mean they're not makabel tumah? What is this kfisha and anchusa? So Rashi says that these kelim are made of bloim, kind of like strips of garment. You know, let's say when garments are no longer usable, they become a rag, so to speak, and they're not makabel tumah. But Tosfos has a different interpretation, and he holds it's pshute kli eitz. So if you have a flat utensil, like a cutting board, that's made of wood, it's not makabel tumah. Now we're going to have to add another qualification here, which will become clear as we go along, and that is that normally these kinds of kelim are not used and are not designated for a dough, so that the amaretz will get the message that this is challah. Uksheba ma'aretz litol, and when the amaretz comes back and he wants to take his challah and present it to the kohen, he's going to be very careful, and he's not going to be metame it. And we'll see why. Notel eshtehem v'eno choshesh. Now these words v'eno choshesh go back to the gabel, right? That's the professional kneader. And you might think that when the Balabayas, the Amoritz, takes the Isa, he's got chulin in one kli, he's got challah in another kli, and he mixes them together, then no doubt he's going to come in contact with the challah, and he's going to be metameit. Ain't no choshesh. We don't have to worry about that, and we'll see why. Now we go on with a parallel case, but no longer are we discussing challah. We're now discussing truma and maser in the case of zaysim, of olives. And here we're not talking about gabolim, who are in charge of kneading the dough. We're not talking about dough at all, but rather badadim. And the word badadim, which describes the profession, the action, comes from the root word bad. And when they took the zaysim and they wanted to convert it into oil, they took it into what's called the Beis Habad. And you may have seen that if you ever go out on a tiyul, like towards Maccabim and Matityahu, all those areas, you'll see the old Beis Habads, with the big stones that they turned around to crush the olives. So there was somebody who was called a badad, and ein osim truma zaysa v'tara. When he has the olives of the Amaretz, he has to assume that even though the owner, the Amaretz, commissioned him to be mafresh truma from the zaysim v'tara, nevertheless, he has to assume that the zaysim were already nitma'u, and therefore, if he would be mafresh truma, the Kohen might come to mistakenly eat truma tmeah. However, there's a way out to circumvent and solve this problem, and that is aval osim zaysim chulav betara v'notel heimenu kidei truma menicha bekelev shel chaver. What the badad could do is he could receive the zaysim that are chulin, and what he's going to do is he's going to involve himself in the process of preparing the zaysim, but the zaysim have not yet come in contact with any liquid, so it wasn't mukhshal l'kabel tuma. So everything is being done b'tara. But now, after he's mafresh truma, where's he going to put the truma? If he puts the truma into the kalim of the Amaretz, it's going to contract tuma, because the kalim of the Amaretz are tamei. So therefore, he puts it into kalim of a chaver. Chaver means someone who is makpid, he's careful and meticulous about all the laws of Tumah V'Tara and the laws of Trumas of Masros. And here, the question of Tosfos arises, why in this case of the Zaysim, as opposed to the Resha in the case of the Isa, why does he drop the ball on Kfisha and on Chusa, meaning Pshutei Klietz, according to Tosfos? And Tosfos answers that those kind of kalim, since they're flat, you could put a dough on them, that's fine, but you can't put Zaysim on top of them, because the whole purpose here is to convert the zaysim into oil. But by putting them into the kalim of a chaver, the chaver is becheskes tara. But now the Amaretz comes along. He wants to take the truma and pass it on to the Kohen. No til shnei ve'ein choshesh. She can take the chulin and the kli that has the truma, and we're not choshesh that the chaver. I'm sorry, that the chaver is not choshesh. She doesn't have to worry that maybe the Amaretz contaminated the truma. So the Gemara asks, the time of my, why were they matir in these cases of truma and challah to put it into kalim, and we're not choshesh that the Amaretz will touch the content of the kalim and therefore be metame the truma or the challah. Rabbi Yochanan mishum kidei chayav de gabel mishum kidei chayav de bada. And what does this mean? Chazal were compassionate with regard to poor people. A gabal who's not, he's not a, shall we say, he didn't go to medical school or to law school, and they pay him, minimum wage for doing this very menial, simple task of gibul, and the same thing in the case of badad. So in order to be chas al parnasaso, they were matir him to be osik b'truma and chalav and amoritz, and we'll see why we're not choshesh that the amoritz would come in contact with the truma or the chal. Utzricha. And now we're going to explain why the Brisa needed two cases, the Gabal case and the Badod case. Tiyashmin in Gabal, oh, he's very poor. Mishum del Nafish Agri. They pay a minimum wage or less. Aval Badod, okay, the Badod is doing a profession that requires certain element of expertise. Nafish Agri gets paid a higher wage, relatively. Aim low, maybe they weren't matir it, and they were choshesh that maybe there'd be a problem of truma tmeya. The Iyashmin, on the other hand, Badod, and Badod is a more substantial, financially substantial person, mishum lo shchiach, because it's not common that you hire a Badad. What does that mean? It's not common. I mean, after all, every season, you're going to need someone to take care of the Zaysim, and he's going to be the one to crush the Zaysim. But the answer is, on an annual basis, there are only very specific times in the year, seasons, in which you hire the Badad. And therefore, he doesn't make that much money, even though he's paid a higher wage than a Gabal. But over the course of the year, the Badad will earn less of a wage than the Gabal, because the Gabal is being paid for 12 months out of the year. Gabal de shchiach, so therefore he has parnas. So again, he gets minimum wage, but at least he's getting those wages for the entire year. Emo, maybe we're not going to be matir tzrich. Omar Mar. Okay, now we get to the essence of the sugya here. Why aren't we choshesh that the Amaretz will be metame the truma the chala? Notel emenu kidei chala menicha bekfisha o banchusa. Oh, ksheba Amaretz litol notel eshtehen. Dena choshe. Why aren't we choshesh? Why aren't the gabel is very secure that the Amaretz would not come in contact with the truma or the chala? And the Gemara says that we sort of fool the Amaretz. We threaten him. And we say to him, Chazi, take a look. If you come in contact with the chala, then I warn you, it's going to go back to the state of tevel. And even the Amaretz is worried about tevel. Haraya, he commissioned the Hafrosha of Trumas and Masros. So he's going to be very careful. They're going to warn him, don't come in contact with this Truma. And how does he know where the Truma is? Because they put it into these special, unusual kelim. Now here we have a slight, shall we say, two opinions about what exactly we tell the Amaretz. One second here, where was it? Yud Gimel. Oh, so the Radbaz quotes the pasuk Upesi Yamin L'chol Dover, meaning the whole thing is a tachbula, and really the Amaretz should not be relying on what they're telling him, but he's a pesi and he believes it. That's the Radbaz. The Chassam Sofer says that in truth the din is azai. That if he comes in contact, the Rabbanan can make a gzera, and they're going to force him to do another afrosha to replace the original afrosha. And how do the Chacham have the ability to be mevatel the first afrosha? They could do so based on the principle called Lev Bezdin Masna. And through that principle, they could be mevatel the shlichus l'mafreya, such that the Gabal shlichus to be mafresh truma was null and void. So whereas the Radbaz says this whole thing is a fig leaf, and in truth, it's not Hadro L'Tivula, but Pesiyam L'Chol Davar, the Chassam Sofer learns that it's actually the case. And they will be Mafkia the Tafrosha L'Mafreya, and it goes back to the state of Teva. So the Gemara asks for Lechush Dilma Lo Ichpasle. Maybe he doesn't care about Shumas and Masros, so it's not a real threat. And he'll go ahead and he'll touch it and be Mitami. We see that he commissioned the Gabel to be Mafresh Bitara. Is Michpas Lo Ichpasle? Are you going to tell me that he doesn't care whether it goes back to the state of Tevel? For sure, if he's trying to get a hafrasha that's valid bitara, he's going to be careful and he's not going to come to touch it. Omar Mar, now let's go on to the case of the Badad, who is dealing with Zaysim of an Amoritz. Notol Emenu Kedei Truma Menicha B'Kelev Shel Chavik Sheba Amoritz Litol Notol Shteim Ve'enu Choshesh. Affecting Amar of Alechus Dilman Nagaba. Why aren't we Choshesh that after the Badad converts the Zaysim into Shemen, and the Shemen is Truma, maybe the Amoritz is going to come in contact with the Truma, the Shemen of Truma, and he's going to be Metamid. Gemara answers Bishlei Mahasam, and the Gemara strengthens its kasha by saying, okay, you solve the problem of the Gabal because you placed the Truma into a Chafisha or an Anchusa, and it's not Makabal Tuma, and it's an unusual kind of placement, and therefore it's Le'akera. The Amaretz is going to realize, hey, this is Truma, and I better be careful not to come in contact with it. But Hacha, in the case of the Badad, Maya Kera Islay, it's the Kalim of a Chaver, and the Kalim of the Chaver are identical to anyone else's Kalim. And the Gemara says, the Manach Le B'Kli Glolim or B'Kli Avonim or B'Kli Adam. That the requirement in the case of the Badad is similar to the requirement in the case of a Gabal, and we put it into special Kalim. Now, these Kalim that are enumerated here are Kalim that are not Makabal Tumah. And yet, you can place Zaysim or Shemen into these Kalim. They do have a Kli Kibul. So now the question becomes obvious. So what does that have to do with Chaver? Forget about a Chaver. You know, we're now doing exactly what we did in the case of the Gabal, and we're not Choshesh because the Kalim have a heker to them, and they're not Makabal Tumah. Why doesn't he just put it into the Amoretz's Kalim if these Kalim are not Makabal Tumah? And the Gemara says, "Hochinami cover." You're right. That's what the Brisa has in mind. When it says in the Brisa, you put it into the Kalim of a Chaver, it's Bekalim Shel Amoretz Haruuyim Lishtamish Ben Chaver. You put into the Kalim of an Amoretz, the word Chaver here is not describing the ownership of the Kalim, but rather the nature of the Kalim. And these are Kalim that a Chaver would use for Truma because they're not Makabal Tumah. And now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah establishes Machziki De'ovdei Kocham B'Shvius. We're going to help a guy to do the work in the Adama in Eretz Yisrael during the Shemitah year. So Gemara says, wait a minute, how can we do that? Machzikin? Are we going to strengthen the hand of the Akum in Shvius? V'Omar Avdimi Bar Shmei the Rav Ein Odrin Im Ovei Kocham B'Shvius. So again, we'll get back to Ein Koflin Shalom in a minute, but as far as Ein Odrin is concerned, you see clearly from this statement of Rav Dimi that we are enjoined from participating with the Akum in those avodos. For example, Odrin, which means to dig, ditches so that the water will collect and so forth. This we're not allowed to do during Shvius. And we derive from this Gemara that a Yisrael is not allowed to work in a Sadeh on Shvius, even though the Sadeh is owned by a guy. And that would mean that Ein kinyan akum lafkia kedushas Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the karka, even though it's owned by a guy, is still kadosh b'kedushas shvius and generates the isur of avodah b'shvius. But the Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Chafov says that they saw someone working in a field on shvius. They suspected he was violating the isur, and then they found out that he was a giston b'socha. A giston b'socha means he was a hired worker, but it was really the son of a guy. So Tosas says that Gam lavoretzel goy asu. You see from our sugya that Rashi in Sanhedrin is incorrect. Rashi says in Sanhedrin, well, you're a hired worker, you're allowed to work in the karka of a guy on shvius, but no, we see from our Gemara that it's not so. It says Ein odrim imovi kocham b'shvius. And there's what Tosas says that the Gemara in Sanhedrin is referring to an oris who is paying up the taxes of the king, and there's a pikuach nefesh situation. If he doesn't work the sadeh, if he doesn't pay up the taxes, he's going to be chas v'sholom. Or the chachamim were machmir in other cases, but not with regard to the melech, because shvius bisman says d'Rabbanan, or maybe they hold yesh kinyan l'goy lafkia mishvius. Now, just to add the seifa of the statement of Rav Dimi, which is not immediately relevant, it'll become relevant soon. We don't say shalom to a guy twice. Once is enough. Shalom is the name of Hashem, and we use it sparingly. In any event, we see clearly that you're not allowed to do the avodas hakarka during shvius in the case of a guy, even though it's owned by a guy. So how then can the Mishnah say machzikin yidei ovdei kocham b'shvius lo tzricha le'meimer lehu achzuke be'alma? It doesn't mean that you're doing the avodah, you're getting down into the trenches on during shvius. No. All it means is that whoever is doing the work, you're allowed to give him, so to speak, a blessing. And you could say the words tichazkena yedechem. You should be strong in your work, or something along that line, and that you're allowed to say to an akum. And that was the minig of various Amoraim. Ki had Rabbi Yehuda Amalahu, you'd say to the Ovakam, Achzuku, or Rav Sheshes Amalahu Ashrata. Achzuku means Techazkenu V'yedchem, and Ashrata is also Lashon Chizuk. And now, once we've already quoted the Seifa of Rav Dimi, we now analyze the Seifa. Ein Koflin Shalom Lovdei Kochavim, Rav Chizda Maktim V'yoyv Le Shlom, Rav Kahana Amalahu Shlom Alamah. We have two different customs of two different Amoraim, Rav Chizda versus Rav Kahana. Rav Chizda would take the initiative and he would say Shalom before the guy would say hello to him. He didn't wait to be in a responsive situation, but rather he took the action. Rav Kahana Amar Lahu Shlom Alamar. He used to say a word that could be interpreted in two different ways. Shalom to my master. He didn't have in mind this guy. He had in mind to be Mavarach his master, meaning his Rebbe. That's how Rashi interprets this sugya. Tosas, however, rejects Rashi because that's called Gnevas das Habrios. And therefore Tosas interprets that although he says it b'kavana shlema, there's no isur, because he wasn't kofel. He didn't say it twice. He didn't say shalom, shalom. He only said it once. Now, the Mishnah says, shalom b'shlomo shal akum, hashtach zuke machzakin shalom b'shlomi boy. You already told us that you're allowed to be machazek yedeim and say to them to chazkera yedechem, and give him that blessing, then certainly you're allowed to give him shalom. Why did the Mishnah feel compelled to tell me that you're allowed to give him shalom? We're talking about a case of their holiday. And therefore, you're going to bring the guy to a state of simcha when you say shalom to him, and he might therefore go bow down to his idol out of this jubilation and celebration. If the Akum realizes how much the Jew was makshiv him, that he went into his house on the Yom Edo in order to give him shalom, then he goes to prostrate himself in front of the idol and express his gratitude. He's so excited and elated that the Yisrael came into his house. However, Mitzvah B'Shuk, if the Yisrael did not go into the house of the Akum explicitly to give him shalom, but rather he encountered the Akum in the marketplace, no sin lo, he could give him shalom, his suffer rough of a COVID rush. Not to get the guy too excited and heft up, because after all, it's Yom Edo, and we're afraid that mitoch simcha yelech v'yodel l'psolah. Rav Huda, Rav Chizda, v'Yasfi, the two great Amoraim were sitting, and Chalafi Azil Gniva, and a Chacham by the name of Gniva was passing by, and they saw him from a distance. One said to his friend, "Nekum Kameh, Devar Uyanu, we should stand in front of him. He's a ben Torah." Amalo, his friend said to him, "No, Makami Palga Nekum. Are we going to stand up in front of a Baal Machlokes?" Gneva was famous for being Mitzayer Mar Ukva, back on Av Zion, who was the Av Bezdin. But Adahachi, while they're debating it, Asa Il Gabayu. Gneva came towards them. Amalahu. Gneva said to them, Shlama Alaychu Malchi, Shlama Alaychu Malchi. So yet he gave them a double shalom aleichem, but he called them malachim, as if they were kings. Amrulei, so Rav Huna and Rav Chizda responded, Minoloch to Rabbaniku malachim. Do you have a source with your wisdom that a chacham is called a king? Amalahu, yes, I do have such a source. The Chsiv in Mishlei Perek Ches, bi malachim yimlochu, which means that through Torah we can be mamlich the malachim, and this has to do with the Gemara that has 3 ksarim b'Yisrael. The Jewish people were crowned with 3 different ksarim: Keser Kahuna, Keser Malchus, Keser Torah. And Keser Torah is the greatest of the 3 because bi malachim yimlochu, it is through the agency of the Chachamim and the Torah that the Melech is appointed as the Melech. Amulei minolach the kaflin and shlomo l'malchi. And how do you know that we should double the shalom and say shalom aleichem alachim? Amalahu di Amar Rabbi Yehuda v'Rab minayin shekoflim shalom l'melech shenemar. And here we go into a parsha in Divrei Yomim with regard to Amsi, who was makabel pnei David melech b'Yisrael, and v'ruach lovshas amosei rosh hashalishim. But we have to read the rest of the pasuk here. Lecha David v'imcha ben Yishai shalom shalom lecha, a double shalom. So we see that we're kofel shalom l'melech. Amrilei, they said to Gneva, Lito marmi, why don't you eat something? Amalahu, Gneva responded, first you feed your animals, and then you can eat. Shenemar, v'nasati esav b'sodcha levemtecha. V'hodar, and afterwards v'achalta v'savat. Hadron alecha, perek hanizokim.